Maria of Guimarães was born so close to the Portuguese crown that her claim existed not in rumor, but in law. For a brief moment, history could have turned toward her. But she was a woman, and that single fact closed every door. No decree was issued, no accusation made. The crown was not denied aloud. It was simply removed, quietly, before she was old enough to ask for it. Maria of Guimarães was born on August 12, 1538, into a royal family already haunted by absence. She entered the world not during a time of triumph, but during a slow, quiet crisis, one that unfolded not on battlefields, but in nurseries and sick rooms. The Portuguese royal house of Aviz was shrinking, not by rebellion or conquest, but by fragile bodies and early deaths. Children were born and then lost. Heirs were named and then buried. By the time Maria drew her first breath, the future of the crown was no longer secure. Her father, Infante Duarte, Duke of Guimarães, was the younger brother of King João III of Portugal. This made Maria a legitimate dynastic figure. Not a distant cousin, not a decorative princess, but a child whose blood placed her dangerously close to sovereignty. In a healthier dynasty, this proximity might have meant little. But Portugal in the mid-16th century was not healthy. João III's sons died one after another, many in infancy, others before reaching maturity. The royal line narrowed until it became a corridor with almost no doors left. Within this context, Maria mattered. She was not born to rule, but she was born close enough that the possibility could not be ignored. Her existence alone complicated succession calculations. In an age when monarchy depended on continuity, her blood represented an alternative path, one the court was deeply uncomfortable acknowledging. She was a girl born into a space where the crown was becoming fragile, and fragility breeds fear. From the beginning, Maria's life unfolded under a contradiction. Legally, she existed within the web of dynastic legitimacy. Socially and politically, she existed outside the imagined boundaries of acceptable rule. Portugal had never had a reigning queen in her own right. Custom, precedent, and political instinct all leaned toward male succession, even when male candidates were weak, young, or unfit. Maria's birth did not inspire hope. It inspired anxiety. Her father's death in 1540, when Maria was only 2 years old, deepened this tension. Infante Duarte's passing removed a male pillar from the dynasty and left behind a daughter whose claim now stood alone, unsupported by a living father. Maria became, almost overnight, a silent problem. She was a child, but also a symbol, one the court did not want to see grow. She was not raised as a future sovereign. No effort was made to prepare her for rule, diplomacy, or statecraft beyond what was considered appropriate for a high-born woman. Her education followed the path expected of a dynastic asset rather than a potential ruler. Languages, piety, courtly behavior, and obedience. What she was taught was not how to govern, but how to be governed by circumstance. Yet her name did not disappear. Behind closed doors, in succession discussions never meant for public ears, Maria's position was acknowledged. She could not simply be erased from genealogies. Her claim existed in ink, in bloodlines, in legal logic. That was precisely what made her dangerous. She represented a future that would require change. Either acceptance of female sovereignty or a restructuring of dynastic norms. The court chose neither. Instead, it chose silence. Maria grew up within this silence. She was not openly rejected. She was simply never invited into the conversation. This was how exclusion worked in early modern courts, not through confrontation, but through omission. No announcement declared that Maria would never reign. There was no ceremony stripping her of rights. The court did not need to act loudly. Custom did the work for them. As she matured, the contrast between her blood and her destiny became sharper. Male relatives, frail, sickly, sometimes intellectually limited, were still preferred as vessels of continuity. Their bodies, however weak, aligned with expectation. Maria's did not. Her capability was irrelevant. Her gender was decisive. This was the tragedy embedded in her birth. She was close enough to the throne that her existence caused discomfort, but too distant, by virtue of being female, to be embraced as a solution. She occupied a narrow, suffocating space between relevance and rejection. The crown hovered near her name, but never descended. Even as a child, Maria was being shaped not toward power, but toward removal. Her value lay not in what she might rule, but in how she might be used to strengthen others' rule. Marriage would later become the instrument of that strategy, but the logic was already present from the moment she was born. She was a living contingency plan, one the kingdom hoped never to activate. In this way, Maria's early life was defined less by action than by anticipation. Decisions about her future were made long before she could speak for herself. The court's fear of a woman too close to the crown did not need to manifest in cruelty. It manifested in planning, in preparation, in the quiet steering of her life away from Lisbon, away from sovereignty, away from choice. She did not lose the throne in her youth. She was never allowed to imagine it. And that, perhaps, was the most effective form of denial. The death of Infante Duarte in 1540 did more than leave Maria of Guimarães fatherless. It transformed her from a royal child into a political inconvenience. At just 2 years old, she stood at the intersection of bloodline and anxiety, embodying a claim that the Portuguese court did not know how to handle and had no intention of honoring. In a monarchy already weakened by the steady disappearance of male heirs, her existence was not reassuring. It was destabilizing. Portugal in the mid-16th century lived under the shadow of uncertainty. King João III watched his sons die one by one, victims of fragile health and relentless misfortune. Each death narrowed the line of succession further, exposing how vulnerable the dynasty had become. In theory, this should have strengthened Maria's position. Dynastic law did not erase women entirely. Her lineage was legitimate, her blood unquestionable. But theory rarely governs power when tradition feels threatened. The Portuguese court did not convene to declare Maria unfit. There was no legal decree stating that a woman could not rule. Such clarity would have forced confrontation. Instead, the court relied on something far more effective: precedent, habit, and fear of instability. A reigning queen in her own right would have represented not just a break from tradition, but a challenge to every male-dominated structure beneath the crown. To accept Maria's claim would have required imagining a different political future. The court refused to imagine it. Thus, Maria's exclusion unfolded quietly. Succession discussions continued as if she were not there, even as her claim hovered uncomfortably in the background. Male relatives, however young, ill, or untested, were elevated as preferable solutions. Their suitability mattered less than their gender. In this logic, weakness was tolerable, deviation was not. As a child, Maria could not protest what she did not fully understand. But the environment around her communicated its intentions clearly enough. She was raised with the awareness that her importance was conditional. She mattered only insofar as she did not attempt to matter too much. The boundaries of her life were being drawn before she had any say in them. Her guardians and tutors did not speak of sovereignty. They spoke of virtue, obedience, and dynastic duty. Maria's education was shaped to produce a compliant instrument, not an autonomous ruler. This was not neglect. It was design. The court was careful not to empower a girl whose very empowerment would complicate future decisions. Behind this approach lay a deeper anxiety. Female sovereignty raised questions that male rule did not. Who would command armies? Who would dominate court factions? Whose family would gain influence through marriage? In a patriarchal system, a queen regnant did not simply inherit power. She redistributed it. For a court already struggling to maintain coherence, this redistribution felt dangerous. So Maria was kept in a state of suspended relevance. Her claim was neither acknowledged nor extinguished. This ambiguity served the court well. As long as she remained silent, young, and distant from power, she posed no immediate threat. The moment she might have matured into a political actor, plans were already forming to ensure she would never stand alone at the center of Portuguese authority. What makes this period especially tragic is that Maria was not excluded because she failed. She was excluded because she might succeed. Her bloodline was too strong, her position too legitimate, her potential too disruptive. In a different political culture, she might have been prepared, tested, even crowned. In Portugal, she was contained. The court's strategy relied on time. Children grow slowly, institutions move patiently. By the time Maria would be old enough to assert herself, the kingdom hoped to have resolved its succession through safer, male channels. And if it failed, there would still be options. Foreign alliances, distant relatives, even union with another crown. Anything, it seemed, was preferable to confronting female rule directly. Thus, Maria grew up watching decisions made around her, never for her. She occupied the paradoxical role of being both central and invisible. Her name was known, but never spoken with intent. Her presence was acknowledged, but never embraced. She learned early and painfully that proximity to power does not guarantee access to it. This was the defining wound of her childhood. Not poverty, not exile, but the slow realization that legitimacy could exist without agency, that blood could place you near the throne, yet custom could bar every path toward it. By the time Maria reached adolescence, the pattern was firmly set. She was no longer viewed as a potential ruler, but as a problem to be managed. The court had not merely refused her claim, it had trained itself to forget it, and Maria, still young, still obedient, was being prepared for the role that would finalize her removal from Portuguese politics. Marriage. It would not be offered as a choice. It would be presented as destiny, from someone who could have been queen to a political burden. By the time Maria of Guimarães reached adolescence, her fate had already been quietly reclassified. She was no longer discussed as a possible solution to Portugal's succession anxiety. Instead, she had become something far more uncomfortable, a reminder of a path the kingdom had deliberately chosen not to take. Her claim was not denied because it was weak. It was sidelined because it was inconvenient. This transition from potential sovereign to political liability did not happen overnight. It unfolded through omission. Maria was never formally stripped of legitimacy, never publicly diminished, never accused of incapacity. The court understood that overt rejection would provoke questions. Silence, by contrast, provoked none. And so, Maria's relevance was allowed to fade in practice, even as it persisted in theory. In a court obsessed with stability, Maria represented unpredictability. A woman so close to the throne disrupted the neat arithmetic of dynastic planning. Her presence complicated negotiations with foreign powers. unsettled domestic factions, and forced uncomfortable hypotheticals. What if the male line failed completely? What if Maria's supporters gathered strength? What if custom was no longer enough to block her path? Rather than confront these questions, the court reframed her existence. Maria was no longer seen as an heir in waiting, but as a problem requiring careful management. Her bloodline, once an asset, became a risk. The solution was not exclusion by law, but containment by circumstance. This shift was evident in how she was treated. Maria's upbringing emphasized restraint rather than ambition. She was praised for humility, not leadership. Her virtues were measured in silence, not initiative. Any sign of political awareness was subtly discouraged, not through punishment, but through redirection. She was taught where her boundaries lay, and more importantly, that crossing them would never be rewarded. Male claimants, meanwhile, were afforded every indulgence. Their weaknesses were forgiven, their inadequacies rationalized. A sickly boy could still inherit. A hesitant prince could still be groomed. Their failures were considered temporary. Maria's potential, by contrast, was treated as permanent danger. She did not need to prove herself unfit. Her gender had already done the work. This imbalance revealed a deeper truth about early modern monarchy. Legitimacy was not merely inherited, it was interpreted. And interpretation belonged to those already in power. Maria's blood placed her within reach of the crown, but interpretation placed her outside its grasp. The rules were not broken. They were bent quietly, just enough to exclude her without appearing unjust. As Maria matured, the court's unease intensified. A child with a claim could be ignored. A grown woman with awareness could not. Her very adulthood threatened to turn latent legitimacy into active assertion. This was the moment when proximity became intolerable. She could not be allowed to remain close to Portuguese politics, where her presence alone might inspire factions or force decisions the court wished to avoid. Thus, Maria's identity was reshaped. She was no longer framed as a dynastic possibility, but as a dynastic complication. Her value lay not in what she might rule, but in how effectively she could be removed from the equation. The language surrounding her shifted subtly, from inheritance to alliance, from future to utility. This reframing carried a quiet cruelty. Maria had done nothing to invite suspicion. She had shown no ambition, voiced no challenge, demanded no recognition. Yet the court treated her as if ambition were inevitable, as if power would naturally gravitate toward her if she were allowed to remain. In doing so, they revealed their fear, not of Maria herself, but of the precedent she represented. What made her particularly dangerous was that she embodied legitimacy without aggression. She did not need to seize power. She only needed to exist long enough for circumstances to collapse in her favor. In a dynasty already weakened by death, such existence was enough to alarm those invested in preserving male control. The solution required subtlety. Maria could not be humiliated. That would create sympathy. She could not be imprisoned. That would create outrage. Instead, she would be absorbed into a role so conventional that it appeared benevolent: marriage. Through marriage, her claim could be neutralized without confrontation. Her proximity dissolved without scandal. By the late 1550s and early 1560s, this logic had hardened into policy. Maria was no longer discussed as someone who might rule Portugal. She was discussed as someone who must not. Her life trajectory was redirected accordingly, not as punishment, but as precaution. In this transformation, Maria lost something more profound than a crown. She lost authorship over her own significance. Her identity was rewritten by others, not because she failed, but because she mattered too much in the wrong way. She became a liability not through action, but through potential. And so, before she ever left Portugal, Maria was already gone. Gone from succession plans, gone from political imagination, gone from the future her blood had once suggested. What remained was a young woman shaped by denial, prepared not for power, but for disappearance. The next step would complete that erasure. It would be called a brilliant match. It would be praised as destiny, and it would remove her forever. Marriage as a tool for elimination. By the time Maria of Guimarães reached marriageable age, the Portuguese court no longer spoke of her future in terms of inheritance. It spoke of her usefulness. This shift was not abrupt, nor was it openly acknowledged. It emerged naturally from years of quiet exclusion, from the slow acceptance that Maria could never be allowed to stand too close to the Portuguese throne. Marriage, in this context, was not a personal milestone. It was a political solution. In early modern Europe, dynastic marriages were instruments of strategy. But in Maria's case, the function was especially precise. She was not being married to strengthen Portugal internally. She was being married to remove herself from Portuguese affairs entirely. The match would need to be powerful enough to justify her departure, prestigious enough to prevent questions, and distant enough to ensure she could never return as a claimant. The choice of Alessandro Farnese fulfilled all three requirements. Alessandro Farnese was no ordinary nobleman. He was the grandson of Emperor Charles V, raised within the orbit of Habsburg power and destined to become one of Europe's most formidable military commanders. His future lay not in Lisbon, but in Italy, the Low Countries, and the broader theater of imperial warfare. To marry Maria to Alessandro was to bind her life to a man whose ambitions would carry him far from Portugal and keep her there. On paper, the marriage of 1565 appeared triumphant. It linked Portugal to one of the most powerful dynasties in Europe. It elevated Maria's status as a consort to a rising star of imperial politics. Court chroniclers spoke of honor, alliance, and mutual benefit. No one spoke of what the marriage quietly achieved: the permanent removal of a legitimate Portuguese claimant. Once married, Maria ceased to be Portuguese in political terms. She became Farnese property, absorbed into another court, another language, another set of loyalties. Any future claim she might have had was now entangled with foreign interests, making it far easier to dismiss. A woman married abroad was no longer a sovereign threat. She was a diplomatic memory. This was not an accident. It was design. Marriage allowed the Portuguese court to accomplish what law could not. They did not need to deny Maria's legitimacy. They simply needed to relocate it. In doing so, they transformed a domestic problem into a foreign irrelevance. Her blood still mattered, but no longer to Portugal. For Maria herself, the transition was abrupt and irrevocable. She left behind her birthplace, her language, and whatever fragile sense of belonging she had managed to form. In Parma, she was received with ceremony. But ceremony does not equate to power. She arrived not as an equal political partner, but as a bride whose value lay in what she represented, not in what she could command. Alessandro Farnese did not marry Maria to share authority. He married her as dynastic protocol required. His life was oriented toward conquest, loyalty to the Habsburgs, and military distinction. Maria's role was not to advise, but to endure. She was expected to provide heirs, maintain appearances, and remain unobtrusive. In this arrangement, Maria's earlier proximity to a crown became irrelevant. Her past was of no use in her new environment. Parma did not need a potential queen of Portugal. It needed a compliant duchess. And so, the identity she had carried, however quietly, was stripped away and replaced with a function. Marriage also erased something more subtle: her capacity to be remembered as a political figure. Once abroad, her story no longer belonged to Portuguese chroniclers. It was folded into the narrative of the Farnese household, where she appeared only as a supporting presence to her husband's achievements. History would later remember Alessandro as a general, a duke, a statesman. Maria would be remembered, if at all, as his wife. This asymmetry was not unique, but it was particularly cruel in Maria's case. She had once been close enough to matter independently. Marriage ensured she never would again. It did not merely redirect her life, it finalized her exclusion from sovereignty. From the perspective of the Portuguese court, the problem was solved. Maria was gone. Her claim, once uncomfortable, could now be dismissed as theoretical, distant, and impractical. The silence surrounding her earlier exclusion hardened into indifference. From Maria's perspective, however, marriage was not a solution. It was a narrowing. The possibilities of her youth, already limited, collapsed into obligation. Her body, her time, her future were no longer her own. They belonged to a dynastic machine that had no interest in her inner life. In this sense, marriage functioned as a kind of political exile without accusation or disgrace. Maria was not banished. She was honored away. She would never again be discussed in Lisbon as a figure of consequence. Her name would fade from succession debates, from anxieties about the crown, from the whispered calculations of power. She had been successfully removed. And yet, this removal carried a cost that history rarely records. For Maria, the crown was not taken in public. It was taken by ceremony, by vows, by applause. And once the celebrations ended, she found herself far from the throne she had never been allowed to approach, living a life whose purpose had been decided long before she spoke her first words, the wife left behind by power. Marriage did not elevate Maria of Guimarães into a position of influence. It sealed her into absence. From the moment she entered the Farnese world, her life began to orbit around a man whose ambitions left little room for companionship, let alone partnership. Alessandro Farnese was not a ruler who governed from a chamber. He was a commander shaped by war, movement, and distance. Power, for him, existed on battlefields and in imperial negotiations, not in domestic spaces where Maria remained. Almost immediately, her role became one of waiting. Alessandro's career unfolded far from Parma. He served the Habsburg crown with relentless loyalty, commanding forces in the Low Countries and across Italy, earning a reputation as one of the most capable military leaders of his generation. Campaigns lasted months, sometimes years. Absence became the norm. Maria remained behind, anchored to a court that did not belong to her, and a marriage that functioned largely through obligation rather than presence. In Parma, Maria was neither foreign enough to be exotic nor powerful enough to command respect. She existed in a liminal position, formally honored, socially peripheral. Her husband's authority did not translate into her influence. The Farnese court revolved around Alessandro's victories, his alliances, his decisions. Maria's life unfolded in the shadows of these narratives, unrecorded and largely unconsidered. Motherhood did not alter this dynamic. Maria fulfilled her dynastic duty, giving birth to several children, including Ranuccio I, who would one day inherit the duchy. Yet even this achievement did not grant her agency. Producing heirs was expected, not rewarded. Her value lay in continuity, not participation. Once the children existed, her role receded further into invisibility. What made this period especially isolating was the absence of political purpose. Maria had once been close to power, close enough that her existence shaped decisions. In Parma, she shaped nothing. She did not advise on policy. She did not act as an intermediary. She did not build factions. Her presence was ceremonial, her voice unnecessary. The court did not need her mind. It needed her silence. Cultural displacement deepened this isolation. Italy was not Portugal. The rhythms of court life, the informal hierarchies, the networks of loyalty, all were unfamiliar. Maria's upbringing had prepared her for obedience, not adaptation. She spoke the language of dynastic submission fluently, but not the dialect of Farnese politics. She was surrounded by people, yet fundamentally alone. Letters from this period are scarce, and silence itself becomes evidence. Maria left behind few traces of inner life. This absence is not accidental. Women in her position were not encouraged to record dissatisfaction. To endure quietly was considered a virtue. Any expression of frustration risked being interpreted as disloyalty or ingratitude. Thus, Maria learned to endure. Her husband's reputation grew while her presence diminished. Alessandro was celebrated as a military genius, trusted by emperors, feared by enemies. Maria, meanwhile, remained static. Her life did not expand, it contracted. Days repeated themselves with numbing consistency. Ceremonial appearances, childbirth, illness, waiting. Waiting for news, waiting for letters, waiting for return. When Alessandro did return, his visits were brief, functional, often dominated by matters of state. Marriage, in their case, was not a partnership of shared experience. It was an institution maintained across distance. Maria was not consulted. She was informed, when information was deemed necessary at all. This dynamic stripped her of any remaining sense of agency. In Portugal, she had been excluded from power because she was too close to it. In Parma, she was excluded because she was too far from it. In both cases, the result was the same. A life lived in the margins of decisions that defined her existence. The irony is striking. Maria had been removed from Portuguese succession to prevent instability. Yet her marriage produced no stability for her. It produced only isolation. She was not dangerous anymore. She was simply irrelevant. Over time, the emotional toll became physical. Repeated pregnancies weakened her body. Long periods of solitude eroded her resilience. Without a meaningful role to inhabit, her sense of purpose thinned. She was fulfilling every expectation placed upon her, and receiving nothing in return. In early modern courts, power was proximity. Maria had none. Her husband was absent. Her influence non-existent. Her identity reduced to a title that carried no authority. She was a duchess in name, but not in function. This was the quiet cruelty of her marriage. It did not oppress her overtly. It emptied her. Her bloodline continued through her children. Her name persisted in genealogies. But Maria herself began to disappear. Not through scandal, not through disgrace, through neglect. By the time the next stage of her life unfolded, she was already worn thin by a role that demanded everything from her body and nothing from her voice. The crown that had once hovered near her life was now unimaginably distant. And yet, the cost of its removal was still being paid. Slowly, silently, inside her, isolated in an Italian court that never belonged to her. As the years passed, Maria of Guimarães did not grow into her surroundings. She receded within them. Parma remained a court she inhabited but never possessed. a space in which she existed without imprint. Her position was defined by presence without participation, by proximity without belonging. She was there, and yet she was never truly part of it. The Farnese court functioned according to a logic Maria had no power to influence. Authority flowed through male networks, military commanders, imperial envoys, clerics, and administrators, whose loyalties were tied directly to Alessandro Farnese's career when he was absent, which was most of the time. The court did not turn to Maria as a stabilizing figure. It turned inward, governed by regents, advisors, and distant instructions from imperial superiors. Maria remained peripheral, a symbol rather than an actor. This marginalization was not accidental. In courts where women exercised influence, it was usually because they were physically present beside a ruling husband, able to cultivate alliances, dispense patronage, and shape access. Maria had none of these advantages. Alessandro's life unfolded elsewhere. His reputation grew in camps and councils far from Parma. Without his presence, Maria's status offered no leverage. She was a duchess without a court. Isolation in such an environment was not simply emotional, it was structural. Maria did not command households in the way powerful consorts sometimes did. She did not dominate court ritual. Her movements were constrained by protocol and expectation. Her interactions limited to carefully managed circles. She was surrounded by attendants, yet deprived of confidants. Invisibility became a condition of survival. Language and culture intensified this separation. Italian court politics operated through subtle codes, gestures, favors, unspoken obligations that Maria had never been taught to navigate. Her upbringing in Portugal had emphasized restraint, not maneuvering. What might have been interpreted as dignity in Lisbon became passivity in Parma. Her silence, once a survival strategy, now further diminished her relevance. Meanwhile, Alessandro's shadow grew longer. His military successes defined the Farnese legacy. When his name was spoken, it carried weight, authority, momentum. Maria's name, by contrast, receded into domestic contexts: childbearing, illness, ceremony. History began to record him. It did not record her. This asymmetry had consequences beyond reputation. It shaped how Maria understood herself. She had been born into proximity to power, then removed from it, and now she lived within its echo. She was close enough to observe how authority moved, how decisions were made, and how thoroughly she was excluded from them. The crown she had once been denied was no longer the center of her loss. The loss had become more intimate: significance. Motherhood, which might have offered a sense of purpose, became another site of erasure. Her children belonged more to the dynasty than to her. Their futures were planned around inheritance and alliances, not around maternal bonds. Ranuccio, in particular, was raised as a future ruler, groomed within male-dominated structures that excluded his mother from meaningful involvement. Maria was present at his birth, but absent from his formation. In this, history repeated itself. Just as Maria had been excluded from sovereignty in her youth, she now watched exclusion being replicated through her children's upbringing. She recognized the pattern, even if she could not articulate it openly. Power did not pass through women, it passed over them. Contemporary observers noted her increasing withdrawal. Accounts describe a woman who grew quieter, weaker, more inward. This was not sudden decline, but gradual erosion. Isolation does not announce itself dramatically. It accumulates. It reshapes posture, health, and presence over time. Maria's body remained at court, but her spirit retreated. The Farnese court did not respond to this withdrawal with concern. It did not need to. Maria's suffering did not disrupt governance. Her illness did not threaten succession. Her silence did not provoke scandal. She became, in the most devastating sense, unnecessary. What distinguishes Maria's isolation from mere loneliness is its political origin. She was not isolated because she lacked companionship. She was isolated because her role had been engineered to be empty. From Portugal to Parma, her life followed a consistent logic. Remove her from spaces where she might matter, then praise her for enduring the removal quietly. In Parma, this logic reached its culmination. She was far from her homeland, detached from her original claim, and embedded in a court that had no use for her beyond reproduction. There was no path forward, no transformation waiting. Her life had settled into a shape that would not change. Isolation became her environment. It weakened her body. It narrowed her world. It erased her from memory even before death. By the time her health began to fail more visibly, Maria had already been living in a kind of political death for years. The court noticed her illness only insofar as it interfered with routine. Her decline was not treated as tragedy. It was treated as an inevitability. She had once been close enough to touch a crown. Now, even her own life felt distant. And in that distance, something essential began to break. Slowly, silently, without witnesses. When the body collapses, where the will was never allowed to go. By the time Maria of Guimarães reached her 30s, decline was no longer an abstract fear. It had become visible, embodied, and undeniable. Her body began to register what her life had long been forced to contain. Years of repeated pregnancies, prolonged isolation, and emotional suppression did not erupt into crisis. They wore her down slowly, relentlessly, until exhaustion became her permanent state. Contemporary descriptions of Maria from this period speak less of specific illness than of a general weakening. She is described as frail, often unwell, increasingly withdrawn. This vagueness is telling. Women like Maria rarely received precise diagnoses. Their suffering was normalized, attributed to female constitution, childbearing, or melancholy. Pain, when experienced quietly, was rarely interrogated. Her pregnancies had come one after another, with little time for recovery. In early modern Europe, childbirth was both expected and dangerous. Even when it did not end in death, it often left lasting damage, chronic pain, fatigue, and vulnerability to infection. For Maria, motherhood was not accompanied by support or recognition. It was duty performed in solitude. The court interpreted her declining health as inconvenience rather than warning. Her value had never been tied to vitality. It had been tied to function. As long as she fulfilled her reproductive role, her suffering remained invisible. Once her body began to falter, there was no alternative role to step into. She had no political function to fall back on, no sphere of influence that might have granted her relevance beyond physical endurance. This is where the tragedy deepens. Maria's will had never been allowed to shape her life. Now, her body followed the same pattern. Decisions about her care, her movements, her treatment were made by others. Illness did not grant her autonomy. It reduced it further. Weakness, in a woman already marginalized, became another form of silence. There is no record of Maria protesting her condition, nor of demanding relief. That absence should not be mistaken for acceptance. It reflects the constraints under which she lived. Expression of suffering, especially when it challenged expectation, risked being dismissed as hysteria or ingratitude. Maria had learned long ago that endurance was the safest posture. Emotionally, she retreated inward. Isolation had trained her to rely on internal resilience rather than external support. But resilience, when stretched too long, becomes depletion. Her world had narrowed to the rhythms of illness and recovery, childbirth and confinement. Each cycle left her weaker, less visible, more dispensable. Her husband's absences continued. Alessandro Farnese remained consumed by campaigns and imperial duty. There is no evidence that Maria's health altered his trajectory. Her decline did not interrupt war. It did not delay ambition. It occurred in parallel, unnoticed by the machinery of power. In this, Maria's suffering mirrors her earlier exclusion from sovereignty. Just as her claim had been sidelined without acknowledgement, her illness unfolded without response. She did not collapse dramatically. She faded. And fading, in history, is easy to overlook. By the mid-1570s, Maria's condition had worsened significantly. She was described as chronically exhausted, frequently confined to bed, increasingly absent from court life. Appearances became rare. Rituals passed without her. The court adjusted seamlessly. Life continued. This seamlessness is perhaps the most damning detail. Maria's removal, first from succession, then from political relevance, now from daily presence, did not disrupt the structures around her. Her life had been engineered to be non-essential. When her body began to fail, the system simply absorbed the loss. There is a brutal consistency in this pattern. Maria's entire existence had been shaped by denial. Denial of authority, denial of voice, denial of choice. Now her body enacted the final denial, the denial of strength. She had been asked to give everything and expect nothing. Eventually, there was nothing left to give. Illness, in her case, was not merely physical. It was the culmination of a life lived under constraint. The body often collapses where the will has long been restrained. What cannot be expressed outwardly manifests inwardly. Maria's suffering was not a single disease, it was the consequence of prolonged erasure. By the time death approached, it did not arrive as shock. It arrived as conclusion. Those around her were not unprepared. Her decline had been visible, if not addressed. The court did not mark the moment as a rupture. It marked it as the end of a process already underway. Maria of Guimarães did not die suddenly. She was worn down. Her body failed in the same way her political life had been dismantled, quietly, without confrontation, without ceremony. And just as no one had protested when her claim was removed, no one intervened when her strength disappeared. The tragedy was not that her body broke. It was that it was allowed to break, in a life where resistance had never been permitted. Died at the age of 39, without explanation, without a conclusion. Maria of Guimarães died in 1577, at the age of 39. The record of her death is brief, almost indifferent. Contemporary sources cite prolonged illness, physical exhaustion, a body worn down beyond recovery. There is no dramatic account, no detailed medical observation, no sense of urgency. History marks her passing not as an event, but as a conclusion already expected. She died in Parma, far from the land of her birth, far from the throne she had once been close enough to inherit. By the time death came, Maria had already been absent from public life for years. Her withdrawal had prepared the court for her disappearance. When she finally died, there was no rupture. Life continued without interruption. This absence of reaction is revealing. In early modern courts, death was often a political moment. Funerals reaffirmed alliances. Mourning demonstrated loyalty. Public grief signaled importance. Maria's death did none of these things. She was not a ruler. She was not a political actor. She was not a figure whose loss required recalibration. She had been reduced, over time, to a presence whose removal altered nothing. Her children survived her. Her husband continued his campaigns. The Farnese court adjusted its routines. There was no documented period of extended mourning, no recorded lamentation by Portuguese chroniclers, no symbolic gestures linking her death to the kingdom she had once threatened simply by existing. Maria passed quietly as she had lived. The cause of death remains vague. This vagueness is not due to lack of curiosity. It reflects a broader pattern. Women's deaths, particularly those preceded by long decline, were rarely interrogated. Illness was seen as natural, exhaustion as expected, early death as unfortunate but unremarkable. Maria's body had served its purpose. Its failure did not require explanation. Yet beneath this clinical indifference lies a deeper truth. Maria's death was not sudden. It was the endpoint of a life structured to drain rather than sustain. Years of isolation, repeated childbirth, emotional neglect, and political erasure had taken their toll. Her body collapsed under the weight of expectations that offered no return. There is something profoundly unfinished about her death. Maria left behind no declaration, no testimony, no written defense of her life. She did not reclaim her story at the end. She did not transform suffering into legacy. Her passing closed nothing. It simply ended. What makes this especially tragic is how easily she was forgotten. In Portugal, her name did not resurface in public memory. There was no reckoning, no retrospective acknowledgement of what had been lost. The woman once close enough to the throne to unsettle the court was now barely remembered as a footnote in genealogies. Her death did not restore her significance. It erased it further. This erasure was not accidental. Maria's life had been shaped to avoid confrontation, to prevent narrative, to dissolve quietly. Death completed what exclusion had begun. Once she was gone, there was no living reminder of the path Portugal had refused to take. And yet, history would soon expose the cost of that refusal. Maria died in 1577. Only 3 years later, Portugal would plunge into one of the greatest crises of its existence. The death of King Sebastian and the failure of the male line would leave the throne vacant. The very scenario the court had feared, uncertain succession, became reality. But Maria was no longer there. Her claim, once sidelined, could not be activated. The woman whose blood had represented continuity was already dead. The court had removed her too early, too thoroughly. When the crisis came, there was no one left who could have embodied an alternative future rooted in legitimacy rather than foreign domination. In death, Maria did not become a symbol. She became a silence. No one asked what might have been different if she had lived. No one publicly acknowledged that her claim had been strong, that her exclusion had been a choice rather than necessity. These reflections would come later, in the margins of historical scholarship, not in the halls of power. Her death closed her story without justice, without resolution, without acknowledgement. It was not the tragedy of sudden loss. It was the tragedy of a life drained of meaning long before it ended. Maria of Guimarães did not die as a queen, nor even as a failed contender. She died as someone whose relevance had been systematically dismantled. Her final years had already stripped her of voice, presence, and expectation. Death merely formalized what power had decided decades earlier. She was 39 years old, and history did not pause. In that stillness, her life slipped fully into obscurity, leaving behind only the faint outline of a crown that had hovered near her existence, then vanished without ever touching her head. The throne crisis came too late. 3 years after Maria of Guimarães died, Portugal faced the catastrophe it had spent decades trying to avoid. In 1580, the royal line collapsed. King Sebastian was gone, presumed dead after the disaster at Alcácer Quibir. His successor, Cardinal Henry, was elderly, childless, and frail. Within 2 years, he too was dead. Suddenly, the throne stood empty. The fear that had once surrounded Maria's existence became reality. Portugal entered a succession crisis without a clear, uncontested heir. The court scrambled for solutions. Legal scholars pored over genealogies. Foreign powers advanced claims. What had once been a theoretical anxiety now threatened the kingdom's independence. And in that moment, history exposed its irony. Maria's claim, once inconvenient, once silenced, had been strong. She had been the granddaughter of King Manuel I through her father. Her bloodline was legitimate, direct, and rooted in the Portuguese dynasty. Unlike some later claimants, she was not a distant relative or a foreign opportunist. She represented continuity from within. But Maria was already dead. The very woman whose existence had unsettled the court in her youth was no longer available to resolve the crisis. Her early removal from political relevance had seemed prudent. Now it revealed itself as short-sighted. The court had eliminated a viable option before understanding how desperately it might one day need her. In the vacuum left by her absence, foreign claims gained strength. Philip II of Spain asserted his right to the Portuguese throne, backed not only by genealogy, but by military force. Other claimants existed, but none commanded the combination of legitimacy and power necessary to prevail. Portugal's sovereignty became negotiable. Historians would later observe that Maria's exclusion had narrowed the kingdom's options. Had she lived longer? Had her claim been preserved rather than neutralized? The succession debate might have unfolded differently. She could have served as a rallying figure, a symbol of native legitimacy against foreign domination. Instead, her absence made that rally impossible. The crisis of 1580 did not merely result from the deaths of kings. It was the culmination of decades of dynastic fragility, avoidance, and fear-driven decisions. Maria's life sits squarely within this pattern. She had been treated as a risk to stability, yet stability collapsed anyway. The irony is severe. The court had feared that acknowledging Maria's claim would introduce uncertainty. In silencing her, they believed they were preserving order. When order finally disintegrated, the tools they had discarded were suddenly indispensable. Yet even in the midst of crisis, Maria was not publicly reclaimed. Her name did not dominate proclamations. Her memory did not inspire official reflection. The court did not admit error. History rarely does so in real time. Instead, Portugal moved forward, or rather, fell forward, into a new political reality. Philip II's accession marked the beginning of the Iberian Union, a period during which Portugal lost its independence and became subject to Spanish rule. For many contemporaries, this was a national trauma. For later generations, it became a cautionary tale. Maria's life acquired new meaning only in retrospect. Scholars began to note the strength of her claim, the deliberate nature of her exclusion, and the tragic timing of her death. In academic margins, she re-emerged as a figure who might have altered the course of Portuguese history, not through conquest, but through continuity. But this recognition came too late to matter. What makes Part 9 particularly haunting is that it reveals the ultimate futility of Maria's exclusion. She was removed to prevent chaos. Chaos arrived regardless. Her life had been constrained to protect a system that ultimately failed to protect itself. The crown she never touched did not remain stable in the hands of men. It passed instead to a foreign monarch, backed by armies and imperial ambition. The fear of female rule gave way to the reality of foreign domination. In that contrast lies Maria's unspoken vindication. She did not live to see it. She did not benefit from it. Her suffering was not redeemed by outcome. But history, in its cold arithmetic, suggests that her exclusion did not save Portugal. It merely deprived it of one more option when options mattered most. Maria of Guimarães was not the cause of the succession crisis. She was one of its casualties, long before it occurred. And when the moment arrived that might have justified her removal, she was no longer there to justify anything at all. The crisis came too late for her, and because of that, it came without her. The silent theft of power. Maria of Guimarães did not lose a crown on a battlefield. She was never defeated, never overthrown, never proven incapable. Her tragedy unfolded without spectacle, without resistance, without a single decisive moment that history could easily record. Her power was taken before it could be claimed. From the moment she was born, decisions were made to contain her, then to remove her, then to forget her. She was denied not because she failed, but because she threatened a system that feared change more than collapse. The court did not need to silence her voice. It ensured she would never be allowed to use it. By the time Portugal needed her claim, she was already gone. Maria's life reminds us that history is shaped not only by wars and kings, but by exclusions carried out quietly, efficiently, and early. Some figures are erased not through violence, but through design. Their absence becomes normal long before their loss is understood. Maria of Guimarães was close enough to touch the throne, and that was precisely why she was never allowed to reach for it.